The HOA president thought they were above the law until they stole a car that belonged to the law. What happens next will leave you speechless. Detective Mike Thornton tightened his grip on the coffee. Kenneth stood near the tow truck, clipboard clutched to his chest like a royal decree, his lips curled in a smirk of triumph. He wore his usual attire, navy blazer, pressed khakis, and an air of authority that was as forced as it was infuriating. His eyes glinted with smug satisfaction as he turned to Roger Whitman, a longtime resident who had lingered near the sidewalk, his expression twisted in discomfort. "That's what happens when people think they can ignore the rules," Kenneth declared, his voice brimming with arrogance. "Unauthorized vehicles are a security risk. I've warned him before." Roger hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He wasn't about to challenge Kenneth openly. Few did, but there was unease in his furrowed brow. "You're sure this is legal, Ken?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. Kenneth scoffed, waving dismissively. "The HOA has full authority over the neighborhood parking policy. If someone refuses to comply, they deal with the consequences." He watched the tow truck driver secure the last strap before nodding approvingly. "Maybe now he'll start showing a little respect." Mike exhaled slowly through his nose, his face betraying nothing. His police car, was being stolen in plain sight, and the man responsible had no idea that he had just crossed the wrong person. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a felony, and Kenneth, in his boundless arrogance, was too blind to see it. A soft chuckle came from a nearby driveway. A younger resident, a man in his early 30s, shook his head and murmured to another onlooker, "Kenneth has no idea what he's just set into motion. Neither did the rest of the neighborhood. But they would soon enough." Mike set his coffee down on the counter with deliberate calm, rolling his shoulders back as he turned away from the window. He wasn't going to storm outside, yell, or make a scene. That wasn't his style. Let Kenneth think he had won this round. Let him bask in his petty power trip. Mike had spent years taking down criminals who thought they were untouchable. And now, Kenneth had made himself the next case study. But there was a difference this time. This wasn't an investigation that needed immediate action. This wasn't a suspect fleeing the scene or a crime requiring an urgent response. No, this was something else entirely. Kenneth had laid his own trap, and Mike was more than willing to let him walk straight into it. He moved through his house with methodical precision, picking up his phone and dialing a familiar number. The call was answered almost immediately. "Captain, we have a situation." A pause, then a measured response. "What kind of situation?" "My department-issued vehicle has just been unlawfully towed by an HOA president who thinks he owns the neighborhood." Silence on the other end, followed by a quiet chuckle. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. And he has no idea what he's done." Another pause. Then, in a voice dripping with amusement, "Well, this should be interesting." Mike ended the call and exhaled slowly. The pieces were moving now, the trap closing inch by inch. He glanced once more at the empty spot in his driveway, at the flashing lights receding down the street, and smiled to himself. Kenneth had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and Mike was going to make sure he learned that the hard way. Kenneth Matthews ruled the neighborhood with the precision of a dictator disguised as a homeowners association president. At first glance, the community was picturesque, well-manicured lawns, neatly painted fences, and an aura of suburban bliss. But beneath the surface, a suffocating sense of control permeated every street, every yard, every household. Kenneth had turned what was meant to be a collective effort into his personal kingdom, where obedience was expected and dissent was crushed. He operated under the guise of maintaining community standards, a term that had once been a mere guideline but had, under his tenure, become an ironclad decree. The bylaws, originally designed to protect the value of the neighborhood, had morphed into an instrument of power. He wielded them like a weapon, enforcing absurdly specific restrictions with an almost sadistic pleasure. Residents found themselves fined for the most trivial infractions: a mailbox that was slightly crooked, a trash bin left out 2 minutes past collection time, a flower bed that didn't conform to the approved color palette. Kenneth's leadership thrived on intimidation. Every household was under constant surveillance, not by cameras, but by an invisible network of informants. Anonymous complaints flooded the HOA office daily, some of them undoubtedly fabricated, ensuring that no one ever felt truly secure. Neighbors grew wary of one another, knowing that a simple grievance could escalate into a targeted campaign of fines and citations. Those who dared to challenge Kenneth quickly learned that resistance came at a steep price. For the elderly residents, the battle wasn't worth the stress. Many simply paid the fines to avoid the anxiety of confrontation. Young families, hoping to find peace in their new homes, were often bullied into submission. Their dreams of an idyllic neighborhood replaced with the grim reality of an unchecked tyrant. The few who tried to fight back were buried under bureaucratic roadblocks, appeals processes that led nowhere, conflicting regulations that always seemed to favor Kenneth, and home inspections that conveniently failed at the worst possible time. The HOA board was nothing more than a puppet show. Each member had once joined with the intent of bettering the community, but over time, they either fell in line or mysteriously resigned. Meetings were mere formalities, a charade to maintain the illusion of democracy while Kenneth made all the real decisions behind closed doors. The rules changed at his whim, often benefiting him personally while disadvantaging those he deemed troublesome. When questioned, he always had an answer, a reference to some obscure bylaw or a convoluted explanation that made opposition feel futile. And now, Kenneth had set his sights on Mike Thornton. From the moment Mike had moved into the neighborhood, Kenneth had viewed him as a problem. He wasn't like the others. He didn't grovel or complain. He paid his fines when necessary, corrected violations with quiet efficiency, and never gave Kenneth the satisfaction of a reaction. That kind of restraint was dangerous because it meant Mike wasn't afraid. And Kenneth despised people who weren't afraid of him. So he had tested him. Small infractions here and there. A warning about a lawn ornament that supposedly violated the aesthetic code. A fine for parking too close to the curb, despite no such rule existing. A citation for a non-regulation fence height, when Mike had merely replaced the old one with an identical model. But no matter how many obstacles Kenneth placed in his path, Mike never took the bait. He complied, not out of submission, but with the patience of a man waiting for something. Kenneth's arrogance made him misinterpret that patience as weakness. He assumed Mike was like the others, worn down, resigned, unwilling to challenge authority. But Kenneth had made a fatal mistake. He had mistaken silence for surrender. The neighborhood was filled with people who had been beaten down by years of HOA tyranny. They whispered about their grievances in hushed tones, fearful of retaliation. They exchanged knowing glances when yet another family mysteriously decided to move away. But Mike was different. He wasn't a man who simply endured injustice. He studied it, dissected it, and waited for the right moment to dismantle it. The moment came when Kenneth decided to escalate his campaign. He issued a fabricated violation notice, unauthorized vehicle parked on HOA property. It was, on the surface, a standard tactic, an arbitrary fine, an attempt to provoke, and he certainly never imagined that he had just picked a fight with the one person in the neighborhood who could dismantle him piece by piece. As Mike watched his car disappear down the street, he knew the game had changed. Kenneth had spent years intimidating others, ensuring that no one ever had the resources or will to stand against him. But for the first time in his reign, he had picked the wrong target. And Mike wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make sure Kenneth never held power again. Detective Mike Thornton had dealt with criminals his entire career, the kind that lurked in alleyways, behind desks, and even inside the very system meant to uphold justice. He recognized patterns, motives, and the telltale signs of someone pushing their luck too far. Kenneth, the self-righteous, power-hungry HOA president, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. It started subtly. A violation notice, crisp and official-looking, tucked into the crack of Mike's front door. Then another, a warning letter stamped with bold red ink, as if urgency alone would convince him to kneel before the throne of the HOA. Each one accused him of some fabricated infraction. Unauthorized vehicle parked on HOA property. Mike didn't react. He played the long game. He had seen the tow trucks circling like vultures in the past, preying on unsuspecting homeowners. He had watched neighbors fold under Kenneth's relentless pressure, paying ridiculous fines just to be left alone. He had studied Kenneth the way a predator studies its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But for now, he simply noted every detail. On the morning of the tow, Mike woke early, instinct nudging him toward the window before he even reached for his coffee. The sight was almost cinematic. The tow truck rumbled like an executioner's drum, chains clanking as they coiled around his black sedan. The amber lights flashed against the pavement, their glow bouncing off Kenneth's polished shoes as he supervised with glee. Clipboard in hand, he paced with exaggerated importance, speaking to anyone willing to listen. Mike exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. He had expected this, but there was a difference between anticipation and reality. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a crime. And Kenneth, so confident in his untouchable status, had no idea that he had just crossed the wrong man. The neighborly whispers had already begun. Roger, a man in his 70s, shuffled closer to the commotion, concern etched into the lines of his face. "You're sure this is legal, Ken?" he asked hesitantly, voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much but never dared to act. Kenneth scoffed, waving his clipboard like a badge of honor. "The HOA has full authority over neighborhood parking policies," he declared, eyes flickering to Mike's front door. "Unauthorized vehicles are a security risk. I've warned him before." Mike watched from the window, unmoving. His mind worked methodically, cataloging every word, every action. Kenneth's arrogance had blinded him to the reality of his situation. The moment that tow truck moved an inch, Kenneth had committed a felony. The driver, a stocky man with oil-streaked hands, finished securing the last strap and glanced at Kenneth. "Ready to roll?" Kenneth smiled, pleased. "Excellent. Maybe now he'll start showing a little respect." That was it. That was the moment the scales tipped. Mike placed his coffee down with deliberate care and rolled his shoulders. There would be no yelling, no frantic protest. Let Kenneth think he had won. Let him bask in his hollow victory. Mike had spent years taking down men who believed they were untouchable. The difference was they had been professionals. Kenneth? He was an amateur playing a game he didn't understand. Mike stepped outside just as the truck began to pull away. His expression was unreadable, his movements unhurried. Kenneth turned to him, smugness dripping from every pore. "Morning, Thornton." Finally decided to step out and face the music. Mike tilted his head, as if considering. "You mean my car?" His voice was smooth, measured. Kenneth barely looked up from his clipboard. "Roi roulette à the roi roulette." "I suggest you take it up at the next meeting." "Oh, wait. You're not a board member." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Actions have consequences, Thornton. Maybe next time you'll read the rulebook." Mike watched the tow truck disappear down the street. "Interesting," he mused. "And when exactly did the board approve this policy?" Kenneth smirked. "Board meetings don't require public approval for minor enforcement adjustments." "Ah." Mike nodded. "And would you say towing a vehicle off private property is a minor adjustment?" Kenneth faltered. It was brief, barely a flicker of hesitation, but Mike caught it. "I have my rights as HOA president," Kenneth said stiffly. Mike let a small, knowing smile play at the edges of his lips. "I'm sure you do." Kenneth's confidence returned, bolstered by his audience. He turned to Roger and the other neighbors. "See? He knows he lost." Mike simply placed his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. "We'll see." Kenneth scoffed, but there was an unease creeping into his expression. He had won, hadn't he? But then why did it feel like he had just made a mistake? Mike turned and strolled back inside. He had work to do. What Kenneth didn't realize was that he had just set a chain of events into motion that he couldn't control. Towing an unmarked police vehicle wasn't just overreach, it was illegal. And with every smug word, every falsified violation, Kenneth had given Mike exactly what he needed. Because now this wasn't just about his car. It was about taking down a tyrant. And the clock had just started ticking. Mike Thornton sat in his dimly lit home office, the glow of multiple monitors casting long shadows across the room. His fingers moved with precision over the keyboard, sifting through the evidence he had been collecting for weeks. Every email, every violation notice, every manipulated complaint, it was all here, carefully documented and categorized. He leaned back in his chair for a moment, exhaling as he surveyed the digital battlefield before him. This wasn't just about his car anymore. This was about an entire community living under the thumb of a tyrant. The first real break came from his own security footage. Pulling up the video feed from the week before, he watched Kenneth pacing near his driveway, the HOA president's silhouette outlined against the street lamp. The man moved with deliberate intent, snapping pictures of Mike's car from multiple angles, checking his clipboard, and making calls. Mike rewound the footage, slowing it down frame by frame. Kenneth's lips moved as he spoke into his phone. It was clear he had planned this, and that made it premeditated. Mike made a note of the time and date before pulling up another file, a copy of the HOA's recent parking violation logs. Sure enough, there it was, his car listed under unauthorized vehicle with a predated infraction warning. Kenneth had fabricated the report days before the actual towing, covering his tracks with paperwork designed to make the incident seem legitimate. That alone proved intent, but Mike needed more. He took another sip of his now-cold coffee and reached for his phone. There was one person who might be able to give him more insight. Dialing Roger's number, he leaned back and waited. The line clicked after a few rings. "Mike!" Roger's voice carried a nervous edge. "What's up?" "I need to ask you something," Mike said, keeping his tone even. "The day Kenneth had my car towed, you seemed hesitant. Like you weren't sure if what he was doing was legal." Roger sighed on the other end. "Yeah, because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to get involved." "I understand that," Mike said. "But you also mentioned something about complaints, about Kenneth making people sign things." There was a pause before Roger spoke again. "He pressured me," he admitted. "Said it was just a formality, that he needed signatures to enforce neighborhood regulations. But looking back, I think he was making us create a paper trail to justify his actions." Mike's grip on the phone tightened. "Who else did he get to sign complaints?" Roger hesitated, then sighed again. "A bunch of people. Some signed willingly, others didn't even read what they were signing. He's been doing this for a while, Mike, and people are too scared to say anything because they know what happens when they do." Mike didn't need to ask what Roger meant. He had seen the pattern. Residents who spoke up suddenly buried under citations, unexpected home inspections, or fines that escalated to absurd amounts. "Thanks, Roger," Mike said. "You've been a huge help." After hanging up, Mike stared at the screen, deep in thought. He needed more than Roger's testimony. He needed something irrefutable, something that couldn't be dismissed as speculation. The next morning, he set out on foot, casually making conversation with neighbors as he walked the tree-lined streets. People were hesitant at first, their voices cautious, their eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. But as Mike continued to listen, a flood of stories began to pour out. A young father forced to repaint his house 3 times because Kenneth claimed the shade of beige was inconsistent. A retired woman slapped with a $500 fine for leaving her trash bin out 10 minutes too long. A schoolteacher forced to remove a flower bed his students had built for a community project because it wasn't HOA approved. Each conversation painted a clearer picture of a man who thrived on control, who wielded rules like weapons to bend people into submission. And the worst part? No one had ever dared to challenge him. Until now. By the end of the week, Mike had compiled an exhaustive list of grievances. But the most damning evidence came when he dug into the HOA's financial records. Using his police credentials, he filed a request for public records and spent hours poring over receipts, transactions, and balance sheets. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Thousands of dollars in fines collected, but no documentation on where the money had gone. Payments labeled as administrative fees with no corresponding expenses. Vague expenditures with no receipts. The deeper he dug, the worse it got. Kenneth wasn't just running the HOA like a dictator, he was using it as his personal piggy bank. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. A contact at the DMV returned his call with startling news. The paperwork used to tow his vehicle had been filed under abandoned property, a legal loophole that allowed HOA boards to remove vehicles without notice. The problem? Kenneth had forged the request, claiming that multiple complaints had been filed against Mike's car when, in reality, there were none. Mike exhaled slowly. False documentation, financial misappropriation, witness testimonies. It was all there, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Kenneth had not only overstepped his authority, but he had also committed multiple crimes, ones that carried serious legal consequences. Leaning back in his chair, Mike stared at the folder in front of him. Kenneth had spent years making people feel powerless, convincing them that resistance was futile. But that was about to change. Now it was time to bring him down. The community center buzzed with restless energy. Rows of folding chairs, filled to capacity, lined the hall, neighbors shifting uncomfortably as they awaited the start of the meeting. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective understanding that tonight would be different. Something was brewing beneath the surface, something bigger than the usual drawn-out discussions of landscaping violations and minor bylaw adjustments. Even those who had previously avoided the HOA meetings made an appearance, sensing that the reign of Kenneth Matthews was on the verge of collapse. At the head of the room, Kenneth sat tall, fingers tapping against the wood of the conference table. He was dressed sharply, as always, navy blazer, crisp white shirt, an air of self-importance radiating from his very posture. But there was something else, too. A nervous energy. The past week had been strange. People had stopped responding to his usual tactics. The quiet submission he had grown accustomed to was being replaced by sidelong glances, murmured conversations behind his back, and worst of all, defiance. Something had shifted, and he didn't like it. Mike Thornton sat in the front row, his face calm, unreadable, arms crossed, posture relaxed. It was the same look he had given Kenneth when his car was towed, a look of patience, of quiet observation. Kenneth had brushed it off then, confident in his authority. But now that look unsettled him. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Reports on budget allocations, upcoming community events, routine business that no one truly cared about. But then came the open forum. Kenneth scanned the room, about to move forward to the next agenda item when Mike rose to his feet. "I'd like to discuss an urgent matter regarding the recent towing of my vehicle," Mike said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. Kenneth barely flinched. He had expected this. "The HOA has the authority to enforce parking regulations," he said smoothly, flipping open his folder. "If your vehicle was removed, it was in violation of what, exactly?" Mike's voice cut through the air, controlled yet firm. "Because from my understanding, my car was legally parked in my own driveway." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And more importantly, it wasn't just my car. It was an unmarked police vehicle." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kenneth's expression remained neutral, but his grip on his folder tightened. "I have documentation proving that the HOA filed false paperwork, labeling my car as abandoned," Mike continued, stepping forward, a thick file in his hands. "That's called filing fraudulent claims. A crime, by the way." He set the folder down on the table, his eyes locked onto Kenneth's. "And that's just the beginning." Murmurs spread among the residents, people exchanging glances, the energy in the room shifting. Kenneth cleared his throat, adjusting his posture. "The HOA operates under strict guidelines." Mike held up a hand. "In the past 2 weeks, I've gathered testimonies from multiple homeowners detailing years of harassment, illegal fines, and manipulation. I've also reviewed HOA financial reports, ones that show thousands of dollars missing, with no proper documentation to explain where it went. That's called embezzlement." Kenneth's jaw tensed. "These accusations are baseless. This is nothing more than an attempt to smear my name." Mike smiled, slow and measured. "Then let's test that theory." He turned to the side of the room and gave a small nod. The double doors swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The room fell silent. Kenneth's face lost its color. Kenneth Matthews, One of the officers announced, "You're under arrest for fraudulent activity, filing false documents, and misappropriation of HOA funds." Kenneth shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is absurd. You can't just—" "Your signature is on every fraudulent document," Mike interrupted. "Every single one." He leaned in slightly, voice quiet but firm. "Rules are rules, right?" Kenneth's eyes darted around the room, searching for support. But his once loyal board members avoided his gaze. The residents who had once feared him now watched with an almost morbid fascination. The officers stepped forward, securing the handcuffs around Kenneth's wrists. He let out a string of protests, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs, the quiet satisfaction radiating from the crowd. As he was led away, the doors shutting behind him, silence settled over the room. Then someone let out a chuckle. It was small, almost hesitant, but it spread. A man in the back clapped. Then another. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause. The tyrant had fallen. The weeks that followed brought change. A new HOA board was elected, led by residents who had long endured Kenneth's abuses. The excessive fines disappeared, absurd restrictions were overturned, and people stepped out of their homes freely, talking, laughing, rebuilding their community. Mike sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, watching as children rode their bikes down the street. The neighborhood, once suffocating under Kenneth's rule, finally felt like a home again. Roger stopped by, leaning against the railing. "You really did a number on him," Mike chuckled. "He did it to himself." Roger nodded, glancing around. "Feels different now." "Yeah," Mike said, taking another sip. "It does." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the houses. The neighborhood had reclaimed itself. And Kenneth? Well, last anyone heard, he wasn't handling his new gated community too well. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, but it highlights the dangers of abuse of power and the consequences of entitlement. It serves as a reminder that no one is above the law and that accountability applies to everyone, no matter their status. Let this be a lesson in justice and responsibility.